Good morning, folks. It's July the 23rd on a dull and dreary day here in the nation's capital. We've been getting some rain, thank goodness, because we desperately needed it. But I've noticed as of late, as things are heating up with the We Charity controversy and corruption in government, that there's something that many appear to be getting wrong with regard to what needs to be done to resolve the current crisis that we're finding ourselves in. So I'm going to ask a question. Have you noticed that words no longer hold their original meaning? That under this current postmodern culture, that every word, keywords, I should say, not every word, but keywords, have exchanged their actual meaning for a new meaning given to them by the postmodern left. Words such as equity and social justice and fairness no longer mean what the words actually meant. They've been corrupted and perverted to take on a new meaning. And as this crisis gets worse, people are no longer able to converse accurately with one another and to have a debate and to discuss what the root cause of these problems are and how we might address them. But I can assure you of this. Electing your guy into office is not going to solve what is essentially a philosophical and spiritual crisis. And in that, I would encourage you to stick with epistemology and ethics when discussing matters with the left, and avoid silliness and ad hominem argument. You can't play whack-a-mole with them because they will invent a new crisis at every turn. And there's a history to this. So this morning, I'm going to review something. I'll give you a Nihilism 101 version of the history of this whole nihilistic mindset. I wrote this the other day, 4 days ago, when I was up in Gracefield at the trailer. The postmodern rejection of empiricism and reality has deep implications. Nihilism is the only possible outcome when self-evident truths are rejected. It is the inevitable result of a deep hatred for the nature of the structure of life itself. This invariably leads to seeking to transcend our humanity to create what Friedrich Nietzsche called the Übermensch, which is nothing other than an attempt to turn us into something we literally cannot be. As an example, never has there been a bigger enemy of real femininity than postmodern feminism, which rejects womanhood itself in an attempt to supersede human nature. The Übermensch translates into beyond man. The Superman, Overman, Uberman, or Superhuman is a concept in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. In his 1883 book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche has his character Zarathustra posit the Ubermensch as a goal for humanity to set itself. It is a work of philosophical allegory with a structure in similarity to Gathas of Zoroaster, Zarathustra. And Zoroastrians are some peculiar religion from the Middle East, as many of you are likely aware. Zarathustra ties the Übermensch to the death of God. While the concept of God was the ultimate expression of otherworldly values and their underlying instincts, belief in God nevertheless did give meaning to life for a time. For a great time, actually. For over 1,500 years it defined the West with this, the belief that man is flawed, yet in spite of his flaws, God has endowed him with the spark of the divine, given him inherent rights, and made him accountable for his own actions. The idea of the sovereign individual originated in no other culture other than in the West. God is dead means that the idea that God can no longer provide these values. The sole source of values exhausted, the danger of nihilism looms. And this is what we're seeing today, a completely nihilistic society, rejecting reality itself and perverting the actual meaning of words. Zarathustra presents the Übermensch as a creator of new values to banish nihilism. If the Übermensch acts to create new values within the moral vacuum of nihilism, there is nothing that this creative act would not justify. Alternatively, in the absence of this creation, there are no grounds upon which to criticize or justify any action, including the particular values created and the means by which they are promulgated. In order to avoid a relapse into Platonic idealism or asceticism, the creation of these new values cannot be motivated by the same instincts that gave birth to those table of values. Instead, they must be motivated by a love of this world and of life. Whereas Nietzsche diagnosed the Christian value system as a rejection against life and hence a destructive in a sense, the new values which the Ubermensch would be responsible would be life-affirming and creative. Yes, so life-affirming and creative that it created Nazi Germany. Because, of course, Nietzsche was the inspiration for Hitler and Nazism, this desire to create the Übermensch. And of course it is the same thing that the postmodern left are trying to create. They're attempting to cause mankind, to supersede his own humanity to become something that he literally cannot be. They've created an entire political structure around it, socialism, that denies the very nature of man and demands, just as Nazism did, that everyone march in lockstep to this creation of new ethics that are inhuman. This is obviously the Ubermensch for Dummies 101 version of explaining why several decades of the academy deconstructing the grand narratives upon which the West was built has left our young people desperate, nihilistic, and fully engaged in attempting to create the Übermensch while subscribing to anti-human ideologies which must, by their very nature, rely on totalitarian force. Because it denies their nature, it denies what human beings actually are. It's only by force that they can be inflicted on mankind. And this entire situation with the virus and all the contradictory advice given us by the so-called experts in disease control have, over the last several months, made the entire world march in lockstep to the dictates of people who contradict themselves constantly. And we're not supposed to notice. That's what's most offensive about it. Words no longer mean what they actually mean, and we're not supposed to notice that they're not only contradicting themselves, but they have used it as a way to crush a free market individual economic liberty economy. And to take from us inherent rights that we were endowed by God with, without excuse, and we're expected to unquestionably march in lockstep. This venture to create the postmodern human resulted in the murder of hundreds of millions under both Nazism and fascism and Marxism and all of its various incarnations during the 20th century. And it will do so again if not stopped. This is my warning. Okay? This is where society is headed. In a remarkable moment of prescience, Nietzsche stated that the blood from the death of God would be insufficient to wash away the resulting carnage. It is time to ensure the Academy restores the grand narratives upon which the West was built, the belief in the sovereign individual, created in the image of God, endowed with inherent rights. Academia needs to admit that rejecting the inheritance endowed to us by our ancestors was a grave error. Western values are not only worth preserving, but they are fundamental to a well-ordered society. And our ancestors were smart enough to create a system of governance, particularly within the Anglosphere, where all the branches of government were separate, and where constitutional law prevented one branch of government from interfering with another. And now we see here in the West that the courts are fully under the influence of largely of the executive, but also of the legislative body of government. So we no longer have separation of powers. We're calling for laws, including many of you right-wingers are calling for new laws. Well, the old laws that are on the books, which should prevent all of this from happening, aren't followed. So here's a question. If the laws that we currently have aren't being obeyed, what would make you think that electing your guy, putting him into office, having them pass more legislation, that those laws won't be followed either? We're in a moral, intellectual, historical, philosophical, and spiritual crisis. And I see so many right-wingers attempting to apply the most ridiculously simplistic solutions instead of going back to first principles and looking at why our society, before our very eyes, is becoming deconstructed. I mean, I had to read all of these novels on dystopia in grade 12 and 13. We were made to read these, and I hated reading them. It was just, it seemed too weird and too creepy. And I couldn't believe that any society could function within this mindset. It was too hideous for me to believe that anyone would wish to. And then I went abroad. And boy, did I get shaken to my boots. I saw what happened when the cloying need for cultural conformity gets a hold of an entire nation. You didn't need government censorship. People began to censor themselves. And then when I came back home in 2015, after being away for only a short 2.5 years, I saw the same damn thing happening here. University campuses hounding for people to shut up. The very place where free thought and free speech was supposed to be nurtured, because universities, it is their obligation, their sacred obligation, to teach people how to think, not what to think. And now we have a government fully engaged in social engineering, attempting to create the Übermensch, to create a society that cannot function because it denies our very human nature. That isn't going to be solved by electing your person and placing them into public office. The problem is far deeper and far more profound. I invite you to think for yourself and quit hoping that someone else is going to save you. You know, Christ manifests himself as the Logos. That is the one who observes reality, God, reality, and dares to speak the truth about him. And in the stories about Christ, I'll tell you who his number one adversaries were when he was here on earth. They were the lawyers in Israel. And remember, it was a religious state. They represented the law, and they were corrupting it. They were corrupting it to gain power and control over their people. And they were using the law and perverting it in such a way that it was denying the very nature of reality, God himself. And Christ told them that they were nothing but money changers in the temple. This is what we have today. We have a legal profession that has deliberately undone the rule of law. Every single foundational principle upon which Western liberalism has been built, and it has a long history, going back to the Roman Empire, and then through, the Anglo-Saxon society, where Witten proto-parliaments were part of their mojo, and in Scandinavia, where Ting, another version of proto-parliament, and in fact in Norway, parliament is called Storting. That means the big thing. It's where big matters are decided. And in ancient tribal culture, immediately after the fall of the Roman Empire, the chieftain only ruled over his people inasmuch as he allowed them to keep their own shit and allowed them to have fair judgments and fair settlements if they had been wronged. And they had a fascinating law in Scandinavia. You could go to the chieftain twice for redress of a wrong. But if you went him the third time and you hadn't taken steps to recover your stolen items yourself, the chieftain said, well, then you lost your shit and you deserve to because you're a coward. I kind of like that. It's in common law, that was known as the castle doctrine, the right, the inherent right to defend ourselves, our property, our home, our loved ones. The state's not going to save you. The state is not the institution for deliverance from a moral, intellectual, and spiritual crisis. Start thinking. Start meditating and praying. Start investigating the history of this wonderful inheritance that we received from our ancestors, because it goes back from Roman times through the Germanic period, through Magna Carta, and on, where little by little common law evolved to grant us justice and real equality before the law. Why? Because Lady Justice was blind and wears a blindfold to keep her blind and carries a scale. Everyone will be measured by the same measurement. There's no special status. There's no intersectional rights. There's no one-legged hermaphrodite trans-testicle from Wakistan with a transmogrified lesbian sister getting more rights than someone else because they've been persecuted by the patriarchal majority. This is all drivel and nonsense. And what's worse, our young people have swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. Talk to your children. Read. Talk to your family and your friends. We need to get out of this crisis, and it isn't going to be through the next election, and I'll be here to remind you of that, even if your guy gets in. I hope you have a great day.